Welcome everyone to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. During the podcast, I've often referenced books about autism and theology and various writings from autistic people about those topics. Particularly, two of the books I mentioned quite heavily in the first 10 episodes came out of the Center for Autism and Theology from the School of Divinity at the University of Aberdeen. So that was Grant McCaskill's book and Stuart Rapley's book that I referenced quite a bit. Anyway, the Center for Autism and Theology has released far more than two books, and many people have asked me to review them or asked to get my thoughts on other books in there. So I thought I'd just do an episode reviewing one of the books that I didn't talk about in the podcast. And to help me review, I have Christian.
Hi.
Introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Christian Hendricks. No relation to either Christina or Jimmy, people ask. It's not spelled the same way. I was one of the people in Jon's research. I don't want to say initial research, but I was part of the interview segment.
Yeah. You've heard his voice.
You've heard my voice a few times. I wouldn't stop talking about the approach to Al-Mutassim, among other things. I live in a small city in southern Ontario, very near to where I grew up, but I've lived in two other provinces in Canada, so you're going to have to listen to two people with Canadian accents this time. I'm not at all sorry about that, for those of you who find it uncanny. Let's see. So I'm autistic, self-diagnosed. If I were diagnosed, it would be autism 1. Also relevant, I think I'm a mostly unchurched Anglican. Unchurched more for autism or health reasons than for religious ones. Like, I would like to go regularly, but I just find it prohibitively difficult. And also relevant, I think, I did go to university, but not for theology. So my ability to assess the theological claims is limited. What I went for was English Lit and later information studies. Anything else?
No, I think that's good. So I asked Christian to review this book with me just because I read it when it first came out in 2023, and I remember not having a particularly good feeling about it, and so I thought I should bring someone else on who also reads the book to make sure that we're getting a good and balanced perspective about it. And so the book that we're going to be talking about is a book called Peculiar Discipleship, an Autistic Liberation Theology by Claire Williams. And yeah, so this book was released in 2023, and it is about liberation theology, and specifically trying to apply the framework of liberation theology to autism. The book, the sort of description that you get in the back, and again, don't read too deeply into this, because this is a description on the back, but it says, this is not a theology of neurodiversity, it is a theology from neurodiversity. In her groundbreaking and daring theological exploration, Claire Williams considers how the experience of God for an autistic person challenges and interrogates our normal theories of knowing God. And that's the summary. If I were to give my own summary, I would say this is one autistic woman's attempt at starting to initialize an idea of autistic liberation theology. I think that's how I would describe it. Would you describe it differently?
No, I think that's right. And I do, in case, I think a lot of people aren't quite as pedantic as I am when listening to things. She is starting to initialize a way of thinking about autistic liberation theology. Having read the book, I could tell, that's, you deliberately chose those words. Like, she's starting to. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that's the best way to describe this book. So it is an attempt to start thinking about liberation theology and autism or neurodiversity. She tends to use those both terms throughout the book. So, overall impressions. Let's just start with that. Um, what did you think of the book, Christian?
I don't want to be too mean in case Claire Williams is listening, but I didn't like it. I liked parts of it. My overall impression is that I overall didn't like it.
Yeah. I am probably in the same boat, which is I found quite disappointing because I was very excited for this book to come out. I saw all the like press releases and the announcement that the book was coming out, and I thought, oh, this is going to be great. This is two topics that I'm very interested in coming together,
and coming out of Aberdeen, which does look promising.
Yeah, and coming out of Aberdeen, which already used a few books that I frequently recommend to people, I thought this will be great. So that's my overall impression. But I often, when I'm reviewing things, I like to say, okay, 3 things you like and 3 things you didn't. So do you want to go first, or should I?
Yeah, I can go
or
first.
We can alternate.
Oh yeah, well yeah, okay. Why don't you do one thing you liked and then I do one thing I liked?
Yeah, so I thought she did a very good job of bringing in lots of people's different stories from across the autism spectrum, interviewing a variety of different people and using those anecdotes to shape her thinking. I thought that was probably the strongest point of the book, or points in the book, where she was talking about the experiences of autistic people, and I think she did it sensitively and appropriately.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that I would say is very similar to that. Do you mind if I read a bit here from Jay's story? Just this line? Yeah. So one of the first accounts she uses is from a person she just calls Jay, the initial. And it ends with, "It is hard being so weird. I am glad that God values the weird. I am hoping that my story will not elicit pity or guilt, but rather that God's people will see autistics in a new way. Amen." And I don't know why I loved that so much, but I loved the way Jay, I didn't actually like all of Jay's account, but like that one, I really gave a sense of the personality and the character of Jay, and it was funny and weird, like so many of us are. And I really appreciated that. And I think it's a good example of the kind of thing the accounts can bring.
Yeah, I thought some of her discussions in the book were also quite good, and just discussions that I would point to people who are looking for ways how to navigate various topics, especially pastors and priests. So she has a topic, one of the chapters is on healing and eschatology and things like that, and many questions that autistic people frequently bring up to me, she addresses, and I think she addresses them in a appropriate pastoral way that would be good to give to a non-autistic pastor, to tell them, here are ways you can talk about this. So if you are autistic and you are specifically thinking about these things for your own, you probably would not appreciate it as much. But in terms of communicating to a non-autistic person, the types of things that you should think about and understand when addressing these issues, I think she did a good job there.
Yeah. I liked one of the discussions she had on the Sabbath. Yeah, this is in the time chapter, which we'll talk about later. But she says creative endeavor is deemed good. The results are pleasing to God, but the time that is sanctified is the time when endeavor ceases and rest occurs. And I think this strikes a good balance between the reality that a desire for productivity can be harmful for autistic people and all disabled people, without saying that productivity is bad, which I think is a risk that a lot of disability, not really disability activists, but people talking about disability on the internet really do run into, is the idea that productivity is bad. And I was worried she was going to go there, and she didn't. And there were a number of that. I'm using that as an example of a number of places where I thought she was going to go into a particular trap that I have seen people go into a lot, and she doesn't. Sometimes she does, but in a number of, like, we'll talk about that. But in a number of cases, she doesn't. I really thought she was going to, and she didn't. And and in those cases, she tends to be balanced and fair, and I think talks about the things that people are trying to express when they fall into those traps, but she doesn't fall into the trap in the end.
Yeah. I thought many of her discussions in the chapter on motherhood were pretty good, in terms of just what I've heard other autistic mothers talk about and their concerns. I think she did a pretty good job of reflecting the various feelings and nuances and complexities that often come with motherhood and autism. Obviously, I'm not an autistic mother, but having spoken to many autistic mothers, the sort of information space that exists out there in the autism mom world is it can be pretty brutal. It can be a mess, and I think she did a very good job of staying out of the mess and not recapitulating a lot of the bad ideas that are often in those spaces, while also taking the concerns that they have seriously.
Yeah, and obviously being aware that exists, and just this one's a lot lighter, but I found some of her personal accounts, so not the ones that she's reproducing from other people, but her own personal accounts. I found some of them pretty funny, and I appreciate that. It's a bit of levity, especially when it's levity that points to something as helpful. There's an extended passage in chapter 3, I think it is, that about, is there cricket in heaven, and how do the problems of cricket, like if you're a cricket fan and there's cricket in heaven, does your team always win? But then what about the other team? And what if people like different kinds of cricket? And like this, she was really worried about this apparently as a child, and she recounts this, and it does go somewhere, but it was genuinely very funny, and I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, that was. I remember reading that part and being like, glad to know it wasn't just me that had those thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I thought about cricket at all, but
I didn't think about cricket, but
minute detail of like, how does heaven work? What are the actual logistics?
Yes. Yeah. All right. So 3 things that you didn't like, or 3 critiques that you have. So I'll start again. One of the reasons that I found it frustrating when I first read it in 2023 was I found like she just stated things without justifying them, and stated things that are often quite controversial, stated things that I think need justification, and you need to explain why you are staking this hard position, and addressing the critiques. Often she would push forward ideas and ways of thinking about autism that are really only accepted by a small sliver of the autistic community, and those ideas were thought as like, I mean, I don't even think the autism community is really a thing. It's like
that's one of mine.
Okay, yeah. It's like a wild, fractured mess of different sub communities, often ones that are at each other's throats. And I thought, if you are speaking into the autism sphere and you're saying this is the way that we're going to think about autism, you should justify it, and you should explain why this and not the other ways. And I got really frustrated when she didn't do that and just sort of asserted.
Or at least tell people where to find that argument.
Yes. Yeah. Or pointed to it somewhere,
Yep.
or
Yep.
this is addressed here or something, and it just wasn't there. It's just sort of dropped and not addressed, not justified, and then things build on that. And so you get to, it's like, okay, we are all the way at the end of your argument, but halfway through
your premises
you dropped a few grenades. Oh. yeah. So like go back and justify those first. Yeah. So that was a frustration point of mine.
Yeah. So, okay, on the part of the there is no autism community, there's a line I've pulled out. One, this is just the first place it shows up on page 7. Is she says the neurodiversity movement, quote, has seen the beginning of cultures such as autistic culture and community, end quote. And there's no such thing as autistic culture, and there's no
Correct.
such thing as autistic community. There are cultures that are formed largely of autistic people, but they aren't similar to one another, and there are communities that are formed mostly of autistic people, but they're not similar to each other either. And anyway, they're like autism usually, unless we're talking about autistic support groups, autism is usually not actually a fundamental component of either the community or the culture. It shapes the community and culture if it's made up of autistic people, but they're not organized around autism usually. They might be organized around an autistic special interest. Often they are. But,
so
autism is fundamental in that sense, but they're not self-consciously autistic usually. And among those that are self-consciously autistic, like you said, they don't agree. They are not like one another. They're very distinct. So I don't think it is sensible to say that there is the beginning of cultures such as autistic culture and community. If this was just one line, I'd leave it alone, but it's not. Like, this is a pervasive problem through that book.
And I think sort of one of the reoccurring things that happens is the labeling of autistic culture and autistic community as meaning a very small sliver of progressive activist autism culture, which, to be fair, is in those spheres, they talk about autism culture, and it's a sort of reflection of their own in-group culture. So that's what they call it. However, in calling it autism culture, it's like, no, this is your very specific culture, and it's not autism culture. It's not autistic culture, right? Like 4chan poll boards are autistic, are a autistic culture. But so anyway, second critique I felt she didn't have a very good characterization of things like the medical model of autism, and often she, at some points when talking about that, states things that are sort of just empirically false, that should have been fact checked or should have been followed up with people who are in those medical communities and medical professionals who have the ability to explain, actually, this is how we made these decisions and things like that. Because sometimes she'll say, this is why they made the decision. And I actually called up 3 different people from my various research who I know are in these fields. Right. And so I made sure my sampling was broad. So I called one who worked in the NHS, one researcher from America, and a clinical psychologist from Canada that I know. And I just said, okay, I'm going to read you these statements. Can you tell me if these are accurate? And in all the cases, they said no. Like, this is not reflective of autism diagnostic practices in like the 2000s or 2010s. Like, that's not how we made these decisions. That's not how we did this analysis. And I feel like you could have pretty easily not said those things. And especially when you're talking about a topic like autism, everyone's going to make mistakes, right? Like, I'm sure I've made a bunch of mistakes. I'm sure I've misspoken, but saying things about like diagnostic practices that aren't reflective of reality, I think is pretty actively harmful. Like in terms of like severe harm, obviously not. Like I don't think it causes a lot of harm. I just think it.
But if it prevents someone from seeking institutional support that they could use, that's a harm.
Yeah, I don't think it would seek institutional support. It would just give people a very wrong conception of what, for example, what Asperger's was, or why people were diagnosed with Asperger's.
Yeah, that section. Yes.
And things like that, and where it's just like, this is, it's just misinformation. And in an autism book for autistic people, specifically trying to educate Christians about autism, who are notoriously a group that don't know a lot about it, having factual errors that significant is, I think, a pretty big issue. I don't know. Maybe she talked to someone who told her that this is what was reflective of practice. I'm not saying this is a lie or anything like this. It's just when you're making statements that overt and declarative, you need to back that up, and you need to nuance it and say, like, one person who works in this told me this, or something like that, instead of making direct declarative statements about the entire field of diagnostic practices in like prior to 2014.
Yeah. All right. So that one of the complaints I have is that it's often unclear to me when Williams is summarizing or quoting other scholarship as something that she agrees with or that she's using to support her argument, or when she is doing it as just a kind of literature review. Some sections, it's clear that she's just bringing up ideas that have been forwarded on this topic, and she's not endorsing one or the other. She's saying this is the conversation. In other cases, it's clear that she's using it as support. In a number of cases, it's simply not clear to me which she is doing. And it takes a bit of effort to make that clear, but it's not, I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to ask her to be clear about. And I found this pervasive.
Yeah, I was going to say that isn't just in one section. That's sort of throughout. Yep. And it's, again, just one of those things where it's like, this could have been better. Yep. Like, and I don't know, like that was sort of my overall vibe from most of the book. Is I could often see where she was coming from, just because I am deeply enmeshed in all these spaces and I have my fingers in all these various different pies. And so when she's saying something, I'd be like, okay, I know where to trace this. I know how to trace this. I know where it's coming from. I understand like the tensions that exist in these arguments, but I'm also just like extremely aware that most other people will have no idea that these other conversations are going on and these difficulties are coming in, and the things that are being said are not things that are without controversy, and that is simply never explained. And again, in a book that is meant to explore ideas of autism and theology in a religious practice that is notoriously ignorant of autism, it's I feel irresponsible is a strong word. I feel it is not great to not explain the sort of holistic picture and arguments against, like, so
my last one is a bit more on the well, I think it's a pervasive problem, but it's also, people who know me are going to think that I'm just being me again. So just being me again, not mean again. So I'm going to read from page 24. Often autistic children do not have the words to explain to themselves, never mind anyone else, what is causing them concern. This may apply to autistic adults too. The need for language and explanation is just one of the many ways in which neurodiverse and neurotypical worlds can come into conflict. So the beginning of that's correct, right? I mean, it's just factually true. But a need for explanation is not unique or particular to neurotypical people. Autistic people need explanation also. In fact, sometimes we need it more than autistic people. I frequently need people to explain to me, you just said something. I cannot understand. I cannot parse it. Or usually more accurately, I can think of 4 different things you could have meant from the thing you just said. I simply don't know which one you actually meant. And I know from past experience that the one I think is most likely may not be it. I am not often, but sometimes wrong about which thing you meant is more likely. So I need explanation, not constantly, but I would say daily. And just for that kind of thing, let alone for why are we doing things this way? Why did you do this way? Why do you want me to do it this way? I need all kinds of explanations. Like it's a problem, not a big problem, not much of a problem, but a bit of a problem. I just don't think it's correct to characterize that as a neurotypical world thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. And also, like, the framing of neurodiverse versus neurotypical is a framing that I think is deeply unhelpful and not reflective of reality in just terms of how things actually work out. Like, it's I don't think that the neurodiverse are a coherent group.
Oh, yeah. No.
Against the neurotypicals, or that the neurotypicals are a coherent, like,
She's
many
talking
times.
about autistic people. She's not talking
Yeah.
about people with bipolar disorder. She's not talking about people with ADHD for the most part. She's talking about autistic people, and she should just say that.
But even when you're just talking about autistic people, I mean, it's not autistic people versus non-autistic people, right? That those dynamics don't exist because autistic people aren't actually a coherent identity group. They're not a coherent identifiable
I mean,
group.
it's a cluster. It's a real cluster, but it's not. It's not homogenous, and there are lots of lines that go through
and
it. And
internally fractious, and many cases you have neurotypicals on the side of autistics against different groups of neurotypicals and autistics. And I think the sort of baked in assumption of homogeneity when you're talking about, the neurotypical or the neurodiverse view is just not very accurate in portraying the reality of how these things play out in a very complex world. So those are our 3 good things, 3 bad things, and I think those are going to come up a lot as pervasive themes throughout the next chapters.
Yes, communication is going to be a theme of my complaints. I'm going to tell you that now.
Yes. So, starting with the introduction. I mean, the introduction is basically where she's just laying things out, and there were many parts where, like I said in the things I didn't like, where she sort of just states things and doesn't give justification. And it sort of, like, I mean, this is obviously a joke, but it reminds me of that one scene from The Office in which Michael Scott needs to declare bankruptcy, and he just stands up in the middle of the office and yells, "I declare bankruptcy." and someone has to come in and tell him, like, you can't just declare it and expect anything to happen.
This isn't like a divorce in the Iron Ages where you can just say it on the public square and it is effective. That's not how that works.
Yeah, and so a clear example of this is one phrase that's used in the introduction. Autistic theology is located in the autistic experience with the assumption that it is a need of liberation. And I read that and I went, okay, are we sure? Maybe.
Yeah,
this
sorry, I want to
particular
ask you
view
though,
of autism. Yeah,
what's
go ahead.
the part that you think is wrong? Do you think the part that's wrong is the assumption, or that the assumption is being made?
I think the part that's wrong is that autistic theology is located in the autistic experience with the
Okay.
assumption that it is in need of liberation.
Yeah.
Because again, when I know a lot of autistic people who do theology. I
Yeah.
know a lot of autistic people who are particularly interested in liberation theology.
Yeah.
And I don't see this.
Right.
And when she's stating, like when she's trying to lay the framework for it, it's like, okay, we're starting to lay the initial framework for an autistic theology.
Mm-hmm.
And this is going to be one of our fundamental primary assumptions, is that it's the need for liberation.
Yeah.
It's like, you really need to justify that. You really need to explain that. And she does go on to sort of get into that in the next chapter, sort of, but it was very frustrating. And another part that just really got me was talking about autistic theology. And she says, autistic theology is similar to other theologies of liberation, such as womanist and feminist theologies, Black theology, and the first liberation theologies of the poor. And I was like, okay, can you show that? Like, can you demonstrate that these things are in fact in a similar category? You can't just state that they're in a similar category, because there are really big differences between the systematic pressures that autistic people face and the systematic pressures of being a racial minority. Mm-hmm. There are extremely broad differences between the systematic pressures placed on women as a sex class than autistic people as disabled people. And the poor, again, in the theologies of liberation of the poor, these are built on the fundamental assumption that there is a economic exchange between the global north and the global south, and that the global north is oppressing the global south. And it is like explicitly baked into economy and the logic of Marxist extraction and colonial theory. Like, these are in there. But where's autism? Like, autism isn't like those things, right? Like, being autistic is not like being an oppressed South American person under the foot of capitalist exploitation of your natural resources, right? Like, that's in a completely different context than the one that Boff is talking about when he's starting liberation theology. It's like when you think about James Cone writing Black liberation theology and the way that he's writing Black liberation theology, that is coming out of a very specific context of extreme racial oppression in the American South under Jim Crow and like the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. This is not the context of autism. And you need to explain and you need to justify why these frameworks would even fit within autism, and why these ideas should have a one-to-one mapping, or an even not a one-to-one mapping, even a close approximation of a mapping, because that's not obvious to me. And I've read all these people, right? Like, I've read James Cone. I have read Boff. These people are doing something and thinking in a way that is in the context of a very specific political economy. And a political economy that autistic people might be part of if they are also part of those racial groups or part of these other things. But just being autistic by itself does not put you in anywhere close to these sort of relationships. And without explaining why there should be a one-to-one mapping, I kind of go, but should we be doing this? Should we be taking the frameworks that apply to Black people and applying them to autistic people? Because I personally think the answer is no.
Not as directly as she does, anyway. Because for those of you who haven't read it, she does it very directly. You're talking about Boff and Cohn, and she quotes them and then says autism is like this, such and such and such. Marcella Althus Reed as well. And that was a very different context. So I agree. When I was reading it, I was thinking these are analogies. You're not using the word analogy, but you are making analogies. And there's a hazard with reasoning by analogy. It's not that you can never do it, but there's a hazard, which is that the analogy doesn't work. And in a lot of these cases, it is not clear to me that the analogy works.
Yeah.
The and parts do not correspond.
Yeah, I think yeah, I personally don't see how the analogies work. And so if you're going to use the analogy, you have to do that legwork in explaining why they work.
You have to make a case for it, yeah.
Yes. And it's just not there. It's just stated.
Yeah. I think I said when I was reading specifically the section in the first part you quoted, my feeling reading that is she's making declarative statements, but what I think she's doing is defining a school. So I don't think she's describing autistic theology. I think she's defining autistic liberation theology or critical autistic theology or whatever you want to call it. I think that's what she's doing, but it's not clear that she's doing that. That's sort of what I figured out, because if I read it as a description, it obviously didn't work.
Yeah, so I can completely buy that she's trying to define a new school of theology, that she's just labeling autistic theology.
Yeah.
However, again,
I don't think it's a good label then. Yeah, no, you should say that explicitly and then use another label. Because...
Yeah, and you should like it would be, it'd be like saying I'm doing Canadian theology, but then you are only referencing a very small subset of like Albertans. And it's like, okay.
If we're going to use an analogy here, it would be like saying you're doing Canadian theology and then everyone you mention is Scottish or American.
Yeah, that would actually be a much better way to put it. That's a better analogy. It's and so it's like, should this be called autistic theology? I personally don't think so. I mean, no. Sure, you can name it whatever you want, but I don't think this is very representative of autistic people, which is another thing that I found quite frustrating. This is a bit of a joke,
but if your description of autistic theology doesn't include Aquinas, I don't know that it or Simone Weil. I don't think it works, because those are the big autistic theologians.
I mean, like it is a joke, but also at the same time, it's like, one of the comments that I made last year, I think, when I was talking to someone else about this book, is I sure wish autistic theology would be something that most autistic people would like or at least come to agreement with at some point. Yeah. And I don't know that is the case. I haven't done the surveying. I haven't forced people to read the book so that I can get their responses to it. However, just talking to autistic people for the amount of time that I have, I'm not entirely sure that this is representative of something that they would actually want to be part of or want to be associated with.
Well, it's not representative, and it doesn't have to be if she convinces them, but I don't think she's done the work to convince, well, not me and not you. So
yeah, and I would suspect not many others, but that does remain to be seen. That's mostly a subjective opinion, to be very clear. So any other thoughts on the intro? Or
no.
So chapter 1 is Trauma and Crisis and Ecclesiology, the Need and Manner of Autistic Liberation Theology. So I read the intro and I had all these questions and I thought, great, she's going to answer them here.
Yeah.
And she attempts to do that, like she starts to do that.
Yep.
I'm not convinced by the case that she's trying to make for it, personally. Yeah, like she does make good, like, she talks about autism, and she does make good points about like misconceptions about autism, which
Yeah.
I think are valid and valuable. Like, she talks about how people often think that autistic people don't want relationships or don't like relationships, and that just isn't true. And it's an assumption that's often made about us. So she does talk about that things, but she does make a few spurious claims that I just am not sure of. So on page 16, she says, the quote, "There are no worse versions of autism." And it's like, I can see where you're coming from in this. And
Yeah.
I know where she's coming from with this.
Yep.
This is coming from a neurodiversity perspective where
Yep.
you are not looking at these things. But within the autism community, like the fractious autistic
Yeah.
community that exists, I think it would be very hard to find an autistic person who has looked at the broad spectrum of autism and not said, this person is more disabled because of their autism.
Yeah.
And you know, does that make it worse or no worse versions of autism? Like, we can argue about semantics, but in a sort of plain way of speaking, and one that I wish she would have clarified more, I think you can kind of say that there are worse versions. There are more disabled people who are more disabled because of their autism. And I personally am fine with saying that they have a worse version, because I think it's a description of fact. But if you don't want to say it's a worse version, I think you should clarify there are no worse versions, but there are people who are more significantly disabled because of autism. And I think that's something that needs to be clarified. Sometimes in autism activist spaces, we try to like condense these things and to flatten distinctions, and I don't think that's helpful for anyone. And I think this is a case where
it is very annoying for autistic people like me who want all of the, like, no, just say it all. yeah I agree. I will say there was a time in my life in which I probably would have said something very close to "there are no worse versions of autism," but I have grown.
Yeah. And I understand where the claim is coming from, right? The claim is to be like, look, if autism in the neurodiversity paradigm is just a different way of wiring the brain, you can't have a worse wiring than other people. And while that is very true, I think you should still say that, but also acknowledge that while there is no one worse wiring than others, because of your wiring, you may be experiencing much more significant difficulties than others. And we should be fine with acknowledging that and talking about that. She does to some extent in different parts of the book, but just not in this part where I think that those distinctions would be necessary.
Yeah.
The next part in here that I really struggled with is her talk about liberation. And one of the big questions that I kept asking is, liberation from whom or what exactly? Like, what are we being liberated from? In the case of other liberation theologies, it's very clear. So with Boff, it's very clear who they're being liberated from. They are being liberated from the capitalist system exploiting them, especially the extractivist global north that is stepping on South America.
And the local representatives of that power.
Yes. In Black liberation theology, it's exceptionally clear who they are being liberated from, and you never need to ask this question. But in feminist liberation theology, same thing, very clear. It is patriarchy.
Pretty clear.
Here, it's like, all right, who are we being liberated from, and what exactly is it that we are being liberated from? And the closest I could get to an answer was neuronormativity. She uses the term neuronormativity. And I think that's the closest part.
I this is my own politics. I think if you were to actually go far enough, the answer is the demands of productivity. So, which some people are going to say capitalism, And yeah, sure, that's one of the ones that does that. But, it's not the only one. But I think, if you were to go deep enough, but she is not clear about that. And then that's not just autistic liberation, right? Like at that point, we're talking
Exactly.
about, a pretty
Yeah.
broad, that's at that point, that's just a Marxist or an anarchist analysis. And that's fine.
Exactly.
I'm on board with that. And I'm on board with talking about how that's going to be great for autistic people. But that stops being a specifically autistic liberation theology.
Yeah. We are back at a general liberation theology, not an autistic liberation theology.
Yeah.
And one of the difficulties is liberation and liberative is sort of assumed common knowledge that everyone knows what that means. Yeah. And everyone understands who it's liberation for and what liberation means. Yeah. And I'm not sure the way that it's used in other academic contexts. Like, I'm very familiar with those academic contexts that she's referencing. I'm not sure the way that it's used in those contexts can actually be applied to autistic people. Like, do autistic people have like an intentional systematic oppression like Black people did under Jim Crow? And no, I think the answer is no. Like,
you could make a case
it's not the same.
You could make a case that people with something with autism 3 or maybe autism 2 are getting close to that. Not the same, but similar. But autism writ large, certainly not.
And what I would have loved to see is a discussion about how oppression and discrimination are differentiated. Because I think autistic people face a lot of discrimination.
Yep.
Like, people with autism 1, autism 2, autism 3, we all face a lot of discrimination.
Yep.
Is discrimination oppression in the actual like technical way that these are laid out theory-wise? And I think discrimination is a factor in oppression.
Yeah.
But it is possible to be discriminated against without actually being oppressed. And I mean, the joke analogy that I always give for this is like, are gamers oppressed? And the answer to that is obviously no, gamers are not oppressed. However, in many contexts, they are discriminated against.
Yeah.
And that can be frustrating for them. But is it oppression from which the gamers need liberation? And the answer, I think, is of course no, because gamers don't experience oppression in that way. And I think individual autistic people will face oppression. Yeah. They will not face oppression as a result of being part of an oppressed class. And maybe this is me like pedantic political theory nitpicking of like my specific interpretation of Marxism and like what it means to be oppressed under like critical theory terms. Right. But I don't think autistic people are a political class that gets oppressed in the same way that patriarchy oppresses women, or in the way that would be used, or in the way that like white supremacy or something like that oppresses Black people.
And if we are, it's as disabled people, not as autistic people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like a lot of us face social ostracization. Is that the same way as oppression and ostracization of racial minorities? Yeah. I don't think it is. I think it is a different thing going on, and I wish she would address that and explain these differences and explain these nuances. And another thing that comes up is the question of liberation versus aid versus reform. Mm-hmm. And so she talks about this for like a sentence where she's talking about liberation versus aid and reform. And she says aid and reform have failed. And she's referencing Boff. Yeah. So she's talking about Boff, who is saying that aid and reform have failed, because Boff is in the context of an impoverished South America under a military junta being propped up by the American government. Of course, aid and reformism have failed in that case, because the political economy in Brazil is very different from like that. And so she uses references to Boff saying that aid and reform have failed, which is very true in Boff's case.
Yes.
And then just saying that basically this is also why aid and reform won't work for autistic people. And I'm not convinced that's true.
Yeah.
Because when you talk to a lot of autistic people, when you talk to the families of autistic people who have ASD2 or ASD3, they aren't asking for liberation. They're asking for reform and aid.
Yeah.
They're asking for help. They don't want to upend the system. They don't want to radically change the way we do everything to accommodate them. They just want help. And I am not convinced that liberation in this frame is one where you could say we need liberation because aid and reformism have failed. Mm-hmm. Have we even tried aid and reformism with autistic people? I would say the answer is not really, yeah. And not really to a meaningful extent. And I think, I mean, just speaking for myself personally, I don't really want liberation in the way that it is articulated, or in the way that it's commonly articulated. I want reform. I like it just on its face. Personally, that's what I want, and so obviously I'm going to disagree with this part of it. But I just want reform because I think that the liberation of me, would come at the cost of other people. Because to accommodate me would demand asking other people to be less accommodated. And I am not comfortable doing that, because I don't think that it is necessary, given, like, if half the church was autistic, let's have a conversation about liberation. Half the church is not autistic, right? Like,
not yet.
2%. Yeah, not yet. One day, when the autism cloning machines finally go into hyperproduction, we'll get those numbers up. But
we'll get
until
there.
that time,
we'll get there. Maybe not in your lifetime or mine, but we'll get there.
Yes.
So I have a theory about this. It's just a theory, and that is that I think if you were to show her a case that you and I would call accommodation and representation in decision making, she might see it as liberation.
I did not consider that.
Can I read you some things? Because I've been thinking about this. Again, it's a theory. I might be completely wrong here. But on page 35, she writes, Autistic Liberation Theology will seek accessibility and hospitality that does not look like accommodation, but instead is a radical acceptance. Radical acceptance does not make reluctant change to marginal institutional practices. Rather, it makes significant, wholesale, and systematic change. Liberative acts of solidarity and radical acceptance will view autistic children who shout and yell as wholly, fully, and completely part of the community of faith, instead of a patronizing accommodation. Much later in the book, on 193, she says that practices that reflect either the theory or the affective dimensions of behavior modification will be unsuitable to meet the aims of Autistic Liberation Theology. So it sounds to me like the appearance matters a lot, and the attitude matters a lot to how she construes accommodation. Like, it's accommodation if it feels like accommodation. But it's not accommodation if you were part of the decision-making process from the start, and if you do not feel like you are being accommodated to. I think, or I suspect, that that's a large part of what's going on here. And if that's true, and I might be wrong, and Williams, if she hears this, is free to correct me if I am. I think I maybe just disagree with her on the use of the word accommodation. Like, I think it's fine to call it accommodations if that's what it is.
Yeah. So the reason that I disagree, that I don't think that that's what she was saying. Like, I thought that maybe that's what she was saying, is there's another part in the discussion about community. Yeah. I think it's also on page 193. I'm sort of just going off the top of my head here, where it talks about Oh, I think I actually referenced this later.
Yeah,
later on.
Yeah, I know the part you mean.
Yeah.
It's about the person in the other room.
Yes.
Yeah.
And how that isn't liberation, but a lot of autistic people specifically request like a sensory room that they can go
Yeah.
to be apart from the congregation because they don't want to bother other people. And
Yeah, I mean,
yeah,
so, but what I think is happening there is that she feels that, this reminds her of, it has, let's see, I'll use her language, that it has the affective dimensions of behavior modification. And I think I don't like to accuse her of going based on vibes, but I think that's part of what's happening. So that to her feels like exclusion. And because it feels and looks like exclusion, it's not liberation. Whereas, you and I would look at it and see, well, the person wants to be in this room. They say that that's the only way that they can participate. So it doesn't matter what it looks like.
yeah, and so I would say, cool. I guess we're probably on the same page. It's just
But you
sort
and I
of
don't care what it looks like, and she does.
yes, yes, and I would say I don't think that's how it's being used in Black liberation theology. I don't think that's how it's
No.
being used in feminist liberation theology, or in just liberation theology, like in the sense of Boff or South American theologians. I I don't think that the because I kept thinking, okay, she's thinking of liberation in terms of all these other liberation theologians that
Yep.
I've read, and I just wasn't seeing it. And I think the reason I wasn't seeing it is because it's not there.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I don't know. Like I said, I think this is a suspicion I have of how, or
Yeah.
an idea I have of how to read her. And I do think that there are other places where she's talking about radical systematic change. I think this just comes to the underlying problem where she is not clear about what she means by that.
Yeah. And so another sort of issue I had with this chapter is the framing of autism as like being trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, I will say, so the quote I pulled was, I believe autistic lives to be traumatized because of their existence in an inhospitable world. Now, I will say, just from having done all the surveying I've done, that's probably an accurate statement. Like I have there's a lot of desperation in the autistic world because of inhospitability.
Yeah.
But I personally, I just don't like the framing of saying because you're autistic, you're traumatized. I think if you are autistic, you can opt in to calling yourself traumatized from that. But I
Mm.
also think it is a very weird label to foist on people and to say you are part of this category, which is traumatized
Yeah.
because of your status of being autistic. And I think a lot of autistic people would inherently have issue with that, even
Yeah.
if they could be described as traumatized, even if traumatized is a good way of describing them. I think, especially when you're talking about self-identification and
Yeah.
the internalized definition of autism and the way of thinking about autism in theology, I think a lot of autistic people would really not appreciate that. I mean, I'm one of the autistic people who
Yeah.
doesn't appreciate that. I would prefer like autism in a theological context to be neutral,
Yeah.
to just be a value neutral thing. And I think trauma is an explicit negative. Like I don't think there's any way you can
No.
say that trauma is anything other than like a very harsh negative
Yeah.
in terms of definitions. Yeah.
I mean, I personally do not think I'm traumatized by being autistic or by being autistic in the world we are currently in. I don't.
Yeah. I mean,
Maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. I don't think it's not just a case of I don't identify as that. I don't think it's a correct description of my psychology. And maybe we are, we as in maybe Williams and I are using the word trauma differently or use the word trauma differently. But I've had this conversation with other people and how, certain autistic behaviors or defense mechanisms that I exhibit are often described as being a trauma response. And I don't think it's trauma. I think it's negative experiences and you react to negative experiences, but I would not call it trauma. And I say that as a person who may have trauma, just not from that, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the reasons I recoil to this is because my definition of trauma is through like the military, right? So like when I think of trauma, I think of beheadings and things like that, and like doing counter trafficking stuff. So that's sort of where my bar is. But I mean, I think a lot of autistic people, it is fair to say that many of them are traumatized.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
However, I don't think I think there's also a very large portion of the autistic population that would heavily resist that defining of,
and to be clear, this isn't a
trauma
for thee but not for me kind of scenario that autistic people often do. Like I agree with you, but this isn't me just refusing that label out of some sort of self-murder complex. Again, because I lived through a natural disaster. I do think I have some amount of trauma from that. So I'm not afraid to say that I may in fact have trauma. I just don't think it's from that.
Yeah, and I mean, I completely agree. Same category. I think I have trauma, not from autism, and not from being autistic. And I know a lot of autistic people who just straight up aren't traumatized, and would not find that accurate. Yeah, and there are some who clearly are, but I think the imposition of autism as trauma and as traumatizing is one that is, I don't think it's a good move theologically.
Now, for the sake of the audience,
for theological definitions,
she does say in some places, or she does qualify in some cases, that most, and then in brackets, maybe all autistic people have trauma. So there are a couple places where she sort of hedges that, but then even in hedging it, she says, but it might be all autistic people.
Yeah, and I think this is an especially prominent way of thinking about autism that comes from very specific online circles that are not reflective of the autistic diversity that actually exists. And I think one problem, I think I say it later in the notes, is that it's a sort of, all the autistic people you know are the types of autistic people that you attract, and so you develop an insular definition of autism that is only defined by the people you know. I don't doubt that for Williams, this is an accurate way of describing autism for her and the other people that she frequently associates with. I don't doubt that one bit. It's just I have access to an extremely wide diversity of autistic people, and I think that is different.
I also want to say on the quote that you pulled that and I know she means something else, but don't we all live in an inhospitable world?
Yeah, that's another good point. Like
there's a quote, and I can't remember what it's from, but it goes sort of something like in the world but not of it, something like that. And I don't know, it just sort of seems like the human condition.
yes that is another really good point. One of the other things that sort of frustrated me, she does address this better, I think, in this chapter than she addresses the other things, but references to capitalism and not differentiating capitalism and labor. This is just something that bothers me, just because I read a lot of Marxist theory, and I have like the ghost of Karl Marx in my head with like the critique of the Gotha program yelling at me. There's a difference between capital and labor and things like that, and what capitalism is and what labor is. I think what she should have done is just said labor and not capitalism.
And it also, I mean, Marx would have complaints, but in a post-USSR world, we can also say that, it's not just capitalism that forces people to
Exactly. One point that I frequently bring up with autistic people when they're like, capitalism is the problem. It's like,
capitalism is a problem. I don't disagree,
yes,
but it's not the problem.
Yes, I have talked to autistic people who came from the USSR.
Yeah.
Let me assure you, it isn't just capitalism that had these issues. Like you will not, you will still be required to labor under socialism. And I think the issue that she's really talking about is not the current forces of economic reproduction in the West. It is labor, and she should be specific about labor and disability and the intersection of labor and disability.
Yeah.
Because labor is different than capitalism.
I mean, it's just a category.
I don't know.
It's an entirely different kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you have any other thoughts on chapter 1?
I do. I have so many other thoughts on chapter 1.
Go for it.
They're not all of them are related, but some of them are. One of the things that you didn't mention that I found interesting, she talks a lot about her Pentecostal background. And I don't know a lot about Pentecostalism firsthand. I have read a lot about it, and I know people who grew up in Pentecostal communities. I shouldn't say that. Charismatic. I guess I don't know for sure it was Pentecostal. And I've been in communities that are adjacent. I went to a church, an Anglican church, that is one of the few in Canada that are part of the charismatic stream of Anglicanism. And so I can't comment on a lot of it, but I did find it very interesting. And she does say a point about the Pentecostal communities. Sorry, this is a quote. Pentecostal communities rehumanize those who are outcasts, and this rehumanizing work is necessary in the experiences of many autistic people. And that is true for sure of some Pentecostal communities in my experience. It reminded me of the some. It reminded me of the episode you did with, remind me who it was?
Ian,
thank you. It reminded me of that episode, and certainly that is a component of the Pentecostal movement. I do really appreciate that. I thought it was very interesting. However, she does point out later in the book a number of places where it has gone wrong, and I appreciate her honesty in that. But there are some places I think she's a bit naive, dangerously naive. And page 33, she says, the Pentecostal practice of discernment, quote, protects the religious experience and by extension, liberative theological discourse from abuse, end quote. And I'm sorry, but that just isn't true.
Yeah, no, extremely not true. And especially not true for autistic people.
Especially not true for autistic people. I have a friend named Ryan Maudsley who I asked if I could share an anecdote that he shared with me a decade ago. So I might be getting some of the details wrong, but he said I could. So he said that in a charismatic church that he grew up in, the leadership, through what they called the gift of discernment, decided that a particular person had the gift of, I don't know what they would have called it, but teaching children, that this person should be a Sunday school teacher. And they made this person a Sunday school teacher. And this person was a bad Sunday school teacher. I don't mean abusive. I just mean very bad at it and not good for the kids. And the leadership was backed into a corner because they claimed to have the gift of discernment, which means that they can tell what gifts other people have. So to admit that this person did not have the gift of teaching children is to undermine their entire claim to the gift of discernment and leadership of that community. They could not theologically or politically admit that they were wrong. So no, I'm very sorry, but the Pentecostal practice of discernment doesn't protect theological teachings from abuse. It can't.
Yep. And I agree with you in your characterization of Pentecostalism. The reason I didn't mention it is that, like, just from all my time talking with autistic people, I don't have a particularly positive view of it, let's say, just because of all the ways it can go wrong for autistic people. And she seems to have a very good and positive experience with it, and that's great for her.
I'm happy for her. Yeah,
happy for her. However, especially in a book about liberation theology, the amount of autistic people who, I mean, you could characterize as oppressed in these cases because they are often singled out because of their autism and because their failure to emotionally respond. And it is the precise symptoms of autism that are being targeted by these communities that, like, she does address it sort of in other parts of the book, saying like, don't exercise your children.
Don't exercise your children. And I'm glad she brought that up. It's a shame she needs to, but she does, and she did. And she talked about the health and wealth problem, which isn't just a problem for autistic people. It's just fundamentally bad theology and harmful to the people who are in those communities. But it is bad for autistic people, especially.
Yeah, and I just wish she would have been more upfront about that and more just clear.
And it
that
does seem like she struggles in the in the introduction. She does talk about her own struggles with the Pentecostal tradition. So I don't think she's unaware of it. I think she's just emotionally committed to her church, and I can't fault her for that. I just would have liked a bit more self-reflection on the harms that Pentecostalism can do. But I did find a lot of her discussion of it interesting. I do have to say. Do you know, she's in a Scottish university, but is she Scottish? Do you know?
She's from the UK. Okay. I don't know if she's necessarily Scottish.
I've been calling things interesting, and I just remembered that in at least some UK dialects, interesting is an insult. I don't mean it as an insult.
We don't mean it that way. We're Canadians. We mean that in a sincere way.
And autistic. We're very literal, especially with the word interesting. Interesting is one of the highest compliments I can give.
Yes. It is meant to be specifically complimentary. Yes. So any other points for this chapter?
This is a completely different thing. She appears disinterested in writing so the Academy can understand her. And I think this is a very hard problem. I am sympathetic to a lot of what she says. I don't think she thinks it's a hard problem, and that is a problem. I will explain. On page 38 and 39, she writes, I do know that my written work is nonlinear and assumes knowledge that I have and other people do not. However, this is a barrier for acceptance within academic research that a liberation theology needs to help overcome. It cannot be that I and others like me have to change the way that we know and process information to meet a standard not designed for us. And I don't know, if you're explaining something to somebody and you leave out things because you have that knowledge and you assume they do and they don't, that's just unkind. And it's also it does not contribute to your goals.
Yes, because unfortunately in her not writing for the Academy, she's also not writing for me. You know, and many other people who are autistic and reading these books and conditioned by the Academy to think,
or even not,
in all these ways.
It would be worse.
Even not.
I'm sorry. It would be harder to read this book if you weren't academically trained to some extent.
Oh, it would be nearly impossible. And I would say you would get almost nothing out of it if you didn't already have a very strong background in critical theory and the various things that she heavily references.
You know, I don't think you need to have read all of Cohn and Boff and
no, definitely not. So on. You need to be familiar.
You would have to have read some of them to get anything from this.
Yes.
And another quotation I've chosen here is, expecting strict standards of logical and rhetorical written work may make assessments a hurdle, let alone the anxiety and lack of control that exams cause. And she's talking here about high school and undergraduate education assessments. And I am very sympathetic to that. I don't want to suggest that I don't think that this is a difficult issue, because it is. It is a very difficult issue to try to walk or to try to manage. I'm deeply sympathetic to that. It seems that she struggled a lot with her communication style and put a lot of effort into trying to be understood and still didn't get great grades and struggled with that. I didn't. I'm fortunate enough that, the way autism definitely affects my language, but breaks even or positive for me, and so, I don't have that problem, or didn't in university. And I'm sorry she did. And it does sound like people were deliberately saying that, oh, she has an autistic communication style in her feedback. And that's garbage. I'm sorry. That's really bad. And I don't like that. I'm sorry she went through that. However, we do have academic standards for a reason. And we can't just abandon them. And it seems like she doesn't want there to be academic standards, or at the very least doesn't intend to meet them. And some of these are just standards of logic and argumentation and epistemological standards. Like
yes,
I'm sorry, you do still have
and
to
just
meet
standards
them.
For clear communication.
And standards for clear communication. A saying
and I mean,
I really like is clarity is kindness.
Yes.
And I think the corollary is also true. Unclarity is unkindness. And
I think
I'm
that's
not asking
through.
you to do better than you can do. I'm asking you to do your best. And it doesn't seem to me that maybe this is her best. And if this is her best, I'm very sorry. Right. But she seems to be indicating that she doesn't intend to try to communicate to these standards. And that I have a problem with.
And I think like it's coming through in our review so far why this is an issue.
Yeah,
because
I think so. Yeah.
We're going through and being like, what is she saying? Why isn't she saying these things?
Yeah.
Why aren't things being properly formatted? Maybe it's just because we've both gone through at least a master's, and so we have passed through the gauntlet of academia and are formed in those ways. But even then, like I
think it would be harder to understand
things
if you didn't have a master's.
Yeah. Like I said, I think it would be impossible to understand, to be quite frank. And I really struggle with writing. I really struggle with written communication. It is something I have struggled with my entire life. I am very sympathetic to that. However, there is a reason that I don't write books or write essays and things like that. And it's because I don't think I can clearly articulate myself well in writing in the way that I think I can verbally. Like there's a reason this is a podcast and not a blog.
Yeah.
Because I know those limitations that I have, and I think instead of saying screw the limitations, I'm just going to do it my way. I mean, it's common tongue is important, and speaking in the common tongue I think is important. And I like you said, clarity is kindness, and I think that that does apply here. Yeah, so I think that's all for chapter 1.
That's all I have for chapter 1.
Yeah, so chapter 2, this will be a lot quicker, I think. Chapter 2 was on time. So in this chapter, Williams goes through and basically sketches out an idea of how we should reconceptualize and rethink about time in light of the challenges that autistic people and other disabled people have with keeping up with the demands of a neurotypical centric world. And the idea is taken from other forms of disability theology, where they talk about how when you are disabled, the way that time works for you is not how it works for other people, and you should be gracious with yourself and understand that your conceptualization of time is going to be different than other people's, and you should not let other people's conception of time overrule your own personal perceptions of it. And you should let those you should allow yourself to think about and articulate these things. I mean, I think that's the best way I can describe it. Is there a better way?
Yeah, I do think that there's an element of other people should, non-disabled people should be generous with you also. It's
Yes.
not just about being generous towards yourself.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true. It's also like saying that, again,
there's
other people should
community normative element to what she's saying also.
Yes. And I personally don't have much to object to what she says in this chapter. I don't find it.
I think some of it's a bit of a stretch, but only a bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
And it's possible, because she's quoting a lot here, it's possible that the original sources fully explain everything that I might want more explanation about, and she just doesn't have the space to do that. That's possible.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, so I am very pragmatic in my approach to theology, where I say if it works, use it. If it doesn't, don't. And so if this approach to thinking about time is particularly helpful for you, I say go for it. Use it. All the power to you. This is a perfectly fine thing to do. It's a perfectly legitimate discursive path to go down when you're thinking about time. No real issues with it. And just, if it works for you, great. But also, if it doesn't work for you, don't do that. Like, I mean, I'm hard conditioned by the military to think about time as extreme precision, meet your timings, hit everything on the dot, and if you don't, that's bad. And so, like, I wish I could reconceptualize time like this, but I just have like a nope. Time is one precise thing, and you need to meet your timings. Which, to be fair, is not great for my mental health. But
no, I don't think it is.
It has not been great for my mental health. But I wish I could take William's framing of time in this, but I also would just simply not be able to intuitively conceptualize time that way, in a way that would make sense for me. So while it's not helpful for me, I'm sure it could be for other people.
Yep.
Did you have any other thoughts about this chapter?
Yeah, the part I quoted at the beginning about the Sabbath comes from this chapter, and there's a whole section on the Sabbath, and I didn't love all of it. I didn't have an objection to most of it. There's about a page and a half worth, though, that I thought was really, really cool. I really liked about a page and a half of a discussion on Sabbath. I don't know that it's practically useful to me. I just thought it was interesting. And again, highest compliment. And however, I would have liked her to talk about the way in which the Sabbath will never be restful for some autistic people if they have to worship in community. It just isn't going to be. And she talks a lot about the Sabbath and rest, right? Which, I mean, of course, if you're talking about the Sabbath, you're going to talk about rest. Obviously, don't. Of course, she has to, and she does a good job of a lot of it. But going to church isn't restful for a lot of autistic people. And it never will be. There's no accommodation or liberation, if you prefer, that will make it so long as it's in community. And I think that's true for Williams also, from the sound of it.
It does, yeah.
And, we're on the same boat on that one. And I just, it's not bad or wrong that she didn't talk about that. I just would have liked her to have talked about that. That's all.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point worth mentioning, and it is something that does come up a lot in my research, is autistic people just simply not being able to do worship in community.
But that's a wish list, Sabbath, not a correction. To be very clear on that.
Yeah, we're going to try really hard to not be, like when you go on the internet and you see like a recipe for how to make French toast, and then someone comments on it like, why isn't this a chocolate cake? Yeah. And it's like, well, maybe go to a chocolate cake recipe. So we'll try not to do that, and just stick to the content. Anyway,
I liked the conversation. Like, I liked her discussion of it. So it was just like, oh, I would have liked to have taken it a little further. That's all. Yeah.
Anyway, that's all for that chapter. Generally speaking, I found it. I didn't find much to really object to. Next chapter 3, is It'll Be All Right in the End. And this is about eschatology and and healing and various topics like that.
Should you define eschatology?
I probably should define eschatology. You're right. So eschatology is the section of Christian theology where we talk about the end times, the final restoration of all things, going to heaven when Jesus comes back. Basically, that's what eschatology is, like the end of time, where we are all resurrected and Judgment Day and all those things fall into that. But in this chapter, it is particularly talking about, in reference to eschatology, it's talking about the post-resurrection. How does disability fit into the Christian eschatology is how it's used in this. So largely I'm cool with the broad strokes. Like I said, in the good parts, I think that there are some sections of this that I would snip out and give to pastors who are dealing with anxious autistic teenagers who are struggling with, am I going to be autistic in heaven? And giving them all these different things to think about, the discussions of disability and those types of things. I would give this to a non-autistic pastor. I probably wouldn't give this to an autistic pastor.
Yeah.
I would give this to someone who doesn't really understand autism. If you understand autism, you would probably, and you are autistic yourself, I think you would do a much better job just personally relating to them, and dealing with their anxieties that way. But if you aren't autistic and you don't know, I think many of the discussions in this chapter are at least worthwhile to think about for if you have to discuss these things with that demographic. Outside that demographic, and there are a few things where I went here, but one of my biggest problems, which I mentioned in the broad overview, is she makes two statements. So one statement is the following. So the quote is, "The term support needs is replacing the previous terminology of functioning. Since the removal of the term Asperger's syndrome from the diagnostic manuals in 2013, ways of differentiating autism have changed. It was long the case that if an individual appeared to the world as normal, but was also autistic, they would receive an Asperger's diagnosis. If autism couldn't be hidden, then it was referred to as plain autism." So this is the thing I referenced at the very, very beginning. I don't know where she got this from.
Okay.
Because this is not actually reflective of the Asperger's diagnosis.
It's not even like a common misconception that I've heard of.
No, and that's where, like, I don't know where you came up with this idea. Maybe someone told it to you. Like, in my most charitable, I'll say you talked to someone who was involved in this, and that one person just had an idiosyncratic idea.
Yep.
However, this is not reflective of broad practice.
Yep.
So the three people I talked to, I asked them, would you consider any of the people that you either interacted with or diagnosed as Asperger's as normal? And they all laughed and said no. Like, they're...
Yeah.
So you have to understand, especially pre-2013, in order to qualify for an Asperger's diagnosis, you had to meet the criteria of dysfunctional.
Yep.
You would not get a diagnosis if you were not dysfunctional. The reason I got a diagnosis, or I got informally diagnosed when I was when I was 16, is because I was extremely dysfunctional and very weird. Like, I was not, no human being on this earth would have ever described me as normal. Most people diagnosed with Asperger's were severely bullied because of their abnormalities.
Yeah.
And I think this, like,
it's just weird.
This actually upset me because as one of these people, it seems like she's trying to make Asperger's seem like it was something it was not. And, like, people diagnosed with Asperger's were straight up not having a good time. And that is the reason they got diagnosed. No one would have even thought to diagnose you with Asperger's if you appeared normal. Asperger's was explicitly for the people who weren't normal.
In a sense, I am maybe more who she's talking about in that I didn't get diagnosed. But importantly, I didn't get diagnosed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You weren't Asperger's because you were normal. Or I don't know if you were normal.
I wasn't. I also had a rough time in
Yes.
elementary school. But, you know, nobody was looking at me like, they're just like, oh, he's sort of weird and doesn't fit in. They weren't like, oh, there's something different about his brain like that. I don't think that was on anybody's radar.
Yeah. And like my mother, I recently went on a trip with my mother, and she was like, I suspected you had Asperger's when you were 4. Right. And I just didn't say anything about it, but it was obvious to me. I have 2 older siblings, and she said, I always suspected maybe they were a little Asperger's, but then you came out, and I went, oh no, oh, this is what it looks like. And so I personally, I'm just like, this, I think this is significantly downplaying the difficulties that people with Asperger's had.
Yeah.
And trying to make it seem like it is a version of autism that didn't have difficulties and suffering and not being weird. I mean, like my nickname throughout all of elementary school was Spaz. Like I was not doing well. And pretty much everyone I know that was diagnosed as Asperger's, same story. Like it is not a case. And I don't know where she got this idea from. And in a book about autism, you can't make mistakes like this. I'm sorry. Like, especially you're trying to do the neurodiversity thing and the activist thing. Like this was bad. And it was one of the few points in the book where I had to just put it down and walk away for a bit, because I was like, you don't know.
Yeah.
This sucked. But yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing she said, which I just have to say, like, okay, this is wrong, is when she's talking about functional labels, she says the statement, these labels are now condemned. Condemned by whom? They are condemned by a very
stereotypical academic question, but it is the correct question in this case. Yeah.
Yes. They are condemned by a very small sliver of the activist autism community.
Yeah.
In very progressive spaces. Everywhere else in the autism community, they are perfectly fine with it, and they use them all the time. It is.
I mean, I kind of know that I'm like, yeah, not everybody's going to like this, and it's not entirely accurate. And, you know, like if I had space, I would explain it in greater detail. But if I don't have space, I'll just say, yeah, I'm high functioning.
In fact, many autistic people will, when they talk to me, they will explicitly say, but I'm high functioning.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to make it seem like they are trying to overplay themselves. And they often feel like guilty about it. And they don't want to draw attention to themselves and say, I'm autistic and I'm struggling as much as someone with autism 3. And many people in the autism advocacy community say, oh, you're trying to distance yourself from these people. And that's not at all what's happening. We aren't trying to distance ourselves when we use those labels. We are trying to say, I know I'm not having as bad of a time as these other people, and I don't want to make it seem like I am having as bad of a time. Like, I'm not trying to make my disability seem worse than it is. I'm just trying to accurately describe it.
Yeah, it seems weird to use this analogy, but it is the closest I can think of. It feels like stolen valor.
It does. It does. I often joke about that. In that case, it feels like you're claiming hardship that you don't have. And so the statement, these labels are now condemned, is not true. These labels are now condemned.
I mean, they are condemned, but they're not universally condemned.
Yeah. She gives the impression that they are universally condemned and rejected by the autism community. They are condemned within a small subsection of activist autistic circles.
And I understand why. I don't want to suggest that I don't understand why. Exactly. I just don't really agree.
And this is like a raging debate within, and like autistic people go at each other on the internet about this all the time.
And look, if I knew a better way of communicating what I wanted to communicate, I wouldn't say I'm high functioning, in part because I don't think it's entirely true anyway. Like, there are things that I do not function very well at all. But how else do you explain it? Anyway, that's not...
Yeah.
We don't need to go into that.
Yeah. All I wanted to point out is giving the impression that autistic people don't use these labels or don't like these labels or condemn these labels is horribly one-sided in an extremely contentious debate.
Yeah.
And I think she should have said, within some activist communities, these labels are now condemned.
Yeah, or say, within some communities these are, or by some autistic activists these are condemned, and I agree for these reasons. I don't.
Yeah,
I'm fine.
That would have been perfectly fine.
Yeah.
But again, those are two statements that are just like wrong. Like, they are not correct information. And I think if you are one of the few people publishing autism Christianity books within this community, you should be careful to try to not say things like that, or at least hedge. And I mean, I'm not going to pretend like I've always done a perfect job at this. I know I haven't, but like, I think those are pretty big.
Yep.
And those should have been picked up and at least modified or changed. And again, with the Asperger's thing, that actually made me mad. I don't know how else to put it, but yeah. Any other thoughts on this chapter?
Yes, this one I do have other thoughts on. You mentioned that you'd like or at least parts of the healing and autism section. I didn't put this in the notes because I just remembered it before we hit record, really. But there's a book which I'm not necessarily recommending or anti-recommending. I'm just called Arriving at Amen by Leah Labresco-Sargent, in which she describes a similar thing to this. Now, she's talking about sin, not disability or trauma, but she describes it as kintsugi, which is the Japanese ceramics practice of repairing broken pottery with gold and adhesive. And I just want to say to anybody who's read the book that if you found that section interesting, you might find her discussion on kintsugi interesting. I think there's an analogy there. That's not what Labresco-Sargent is talking about, but that's the thing I thought I'd offer. Regarding the will I be autistic in heaven question, I'm going to try not to just talk a lot about this because I do have a lot of feelings about this. But okay, so I can summarize. I'm going to summarize it as best I can in two little things. She talks about on page 98, a non-speaking autistic person might want to be able to speak in the future, but they might not be able to. And who would they be if they could speak when everything about them has been formed through the communication that they now have? And everything about them? Really? And I want to point out, too, that she is not saying... She's, I think, being very careful not to speak for somebody here. She doesn't say, whereas she does say earlier in the chapter that a person who lost a limb late in life might want their limb back in heaven, whereas a person who never had that limb, they were born without it, might not want some alien appendage grafted to them in heaven. And she does... It sounds like she is reporting the experiences of real people. I don't see her reporting the experience of a non-speaking autistic person wanting to continue to be non-speaking in heaven. I don't think she's doing that. And I mean, if she hasn't met such a person, yeah, she shouldn't, and that's good. But then, like, why do we have this here?
I think the point you made about everything is one that comes up a lot when we talk about like curing autism and things like that. And this is a very inter-autism debate. The reason I said the reason I said I would recommend this to a non-autistic person is because a non-autistic person probably hasn't thought as deeply about these things as an autistic person has, and so wouldn't be able to articulate what they probably should be articulating. But like, whenever anyone asks me about a cure to autism, or like, will you be autistic in heaven, or will my autism be cured in heaven, I always ask, what does that mean? Because there are aspects of autism that I would love to be rid of. To just be very frank, like, I hate that I can't intuitively understand people. I hate that I have to go through all these like algorithmic decision-making processes that I've developed over a huge lifetime of just repeatedly having to make associations that I don't quite understand. I wish I could intuitively and spontaneously relate to people, and I'm going to be super disappointed if that's not there in the eschaton. And even though that has deeply formed who I am, and deeply formed who I have become, there are just things where it's like, I would have not liked to be shaped by this disability in the way that I have. And I think that's also totally fine to say.
This is kind of the kintsugi thing. I do find appealing the idea that all of these problems will be turned to gold in some metaphorical sense. Like, they'll still be there, but now they'll be something else. And it's like, they're still part of you. They are still part of who you are, but they're part of your past, and they've been changed now. And your past remains part of you in traces. But so the issue here, I think, is that there are people who believe intuitively that the philosophical problem of personal identity has been solved, and that they know what the answer is. And they're wrong. I mean, they might have the right answer, but they're wrong that it's solved. It is an extremely difficult problem. If you are a person like me, I think you'll highly enjoy reading the Stanford Encyclopedia's many entries on the different responses to the problem of personal identity. I have read them all. I think they're excellent. I don't think most people will enjoy them, but I mean, I really did. It is a hard problem. Having read them, my takeaway is, I don't know what the answer is. And I don't think anybody does. That's my feeling. I don't think anybody knows what personal identity is, including the people who say that there isn't any. It's like, no, there's something here. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's wrong to say that there isn't any. But also, if you think you know what it is, you're wrong. Or, you might have happened on the right one, but it's not a justified belief. And so a lot of the conversation I have seen in Williams and not in Williams, in other places, seems to assume a particular position in that problem. And I'm sorry, you can't do that.
Or if you are going to do that, you need to justify it, and you need to.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, you can't assume it. You have to just give a reason. I mean, I guess you can assume it. I can't stop you, but
you can shout, "I declare bankruptcy" in the middle of the office if you would like.
Your attempts to communicate, though, will fail. So that was one thing that I kept sort of, wanted to prepare a lecture about, but didn't, because you don't want this to be a 3-hour video.
We're getting there anyway.
The other thing is, and this is just a personal bugbear, I might be wrong, and actually from something you said earlier in the discussion on this chapter, I'm starting to think actually probably I am wrong. But on page 99, she says, what eschatology should be able to do is account for the ending of pain and misery in the perfection of the world to come without enforcing universalizing normativity with ideas of perfected bodies. And my thought is, why? That sounds like an unforced error. You can just not speculate about the eschaton. Like, you can do that.
I think, yeah. So I think that's a perfectly valid response. Many that won't stop a lot of autistic people from speculating and really wanting answers.
Yeah. To be clear, I think folk eschatologies are really interesting. I would love to study what people think about the afterlife. I don't think it's really wrong to speculate about it. I think you shouldn't form opinions about it. And I think there's a risk in speculating that you will form an opinion. But so long as you don't form an opinion, I think it's fine. I think fiction about the afterlife is fine and interesting, so long as you're clear that it's fiction. I think like that could be very much like science fiction, where the cliche about science fiction, it's true though, is that it's nominally about the future, but it's actually about the present, right? And I think if you are doing some kind of fiction or apocalyptic vision about the afterlife, but it's not really about the afterlife, it's about the kingdom of God as it exists today, I think that's fine, so long as you're clear that it's fiction. But once we start forming opinions about the eschaton, you don't have to do that. No one is making you do that. You're not obliged to do that. And you have no grounds on which to base those opinions. Just don't, is my feeling. Now, lots of people do. I don't want to say they're bad for doing so. It feels like an unforced error.
So I would agree with you largely on that, because that's normally what I tell people is like, there is no way of knowing this. You can speculate all you'd like, but there's no way on this side of the eschaton that you're going to know anything about the other side. Just it's not a particularly helpful thing to do.
One point I think people don't think about is I don't know enough about theology to say where this comes from or if it's orthodox or not, but it's commonly said that time will be different in the afterlife, that it will be in fact eternal, timeless, or at any rate, time's not going to be the same. In which case, cognition is time-bound. The cognition is very sequential. Even if you're not a nonlinear thinker, it's still time-based. I don't know that it makes sense to talk about cognitive styles in the eschaton.
I would also agree with you on that.
So I don't know that autism and allism are coherent concepts in the eschaton. I'm not saying they're not. I just don't. That's one specific example of the kind of problem I think there is in thinking too much about what life will be like in heaven.
And I think that brings up a good point, in that like autism is only a useful category insofar as it defines a disability. Yep. It isn't. I don't think it's a useful category outside of that. If everyone was autistic, there would be no need for the label autistic. It's just, I don't think taking our current context and trying to imagine it in a fully realized eschatological future is going to breed much use, and taking in our current concepts. Like, I mean, I always joke about Origen's idea that we're going to have, that our bodies.
I was just about to bring that up. It's like, listen, we're all going to have orb bodies. Yes. We're all going to be spheres harmonizing in a single eternal moment. We're not going to be thinking.
Exactly. Get orb pilled.
Yep.
Yeah. So one of the reasons that I said I would recommend this for a neurotypical pastor talking to an anxious autistic teenager is because there are also like really complicated and nuanced discussions that I don't think she quite got into that I think
Yeah.
I have these conversations with autistic people a lot who are trying to be like super positive about their autism, but also clearly struggling with it. And I think like in that quote, the what eschatology should be able to do is account for the ending of pain and misery in the perfection of the world to come without enforcing universalizing normativity with the ideas of perfected bodies or perfect bodies. And throughout a lot of her discussions, there is this idea that it is bad to be resentful of certain aspects of your autism. And I simply don't think that is a good or healthy way to operate. Sometimes autism is just disabling and it just sucks. And I think that this framing that she sort of doesn't explicitly say, and she does nuance things, but
I was just going to say for the people who haven't read the book, she does in some places explicitly point that out. It's just that she keeps slipping back into treating it as something that isn't bad.
And I just think there is a lot of room for just not. I think the best framing of autism is a neutral framing, neither positive nor negative, and just like pure neutrality. But that's just my own personal thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, speaking personally, I see it as predominantly negative.
And I mean, like,
and again, most people probably don't think I'm autistic unless I tell them. Some people clock me, but most don't. If you're going to be like, "Oh, he's not," it's like, yeah, I guess my autism is not especially bad, but no, I see it. Even I see it as primarily negative. I'm going to be honest with you.
And I mean that's mostly my experience. Like my experience with it is it's mostly a negative, disabling thing. And that being said, I still think that like neutral framing is the best way to think about it, where it's not an evil thing that must be overcome or a good thing or something like that. It's just a thing, and modifying and changing is fine. Like there should be no moral value on change. And no, because if it's something good and you are trying to change it, that is morally negative, right? Like changing a good thing to a different state is something that is bad. Where in this case, I think you just think of it as a thing, not something that holds moral weight. But anyway, next chapter. Moving along, motherhood and solidarity. So this chapter is obviously not for me. I'm not a mom. I have no experience with motherhood. Neither is Christian. I asked various mothers about the ideas in this chapter and quoted a few things from them, some of them autistic, some of them not. I asked some autistic moms that I know that have read this chapter to comment on it if they had any thoughts, and the reviews were sort of what we've all been saying pretty consistently throughout, where they felt very much along the same lines that we have about the various issues. However, they often did bring up some positive things. So one, they really liked the anecdotes throughout this chapter. So this chapter is very anecdote heavy, I would say.
I'm going to have a comment about that, but we can save it for later.
Yeah, and it's very anecdote heavy, and a lot of the anecdotes, a lot of these people said were useful and were meaningful. They wish they would have done more with them. Is often the comment. Like there was things that there could have been more, and there was potential here. But again, it's the going to a recipe website for French toast and asking it to be chocolate cake. So we're trying not to do that, but yeah, this part was fine, I guess. There were parts like don't exercise your child. Good,
and people,
say that.
Some people watching this are going to think that that's just like a joke. No, that happens. No. It's bad.
Yeah,
it shouldn't happen. is horrible.
Yeah.
Don't do it.
Yes. And so like laying out those things and laying out like just basics that other people will probably not be familiar with if they are not deeply embedded in the autism sauce. She does point out a lot of those important things. So I don't think it's that bad. Yeah. Anyways, those are my overall thoughts. Again, I'm not an autistic mother. I don't have a whole lot to I feel it's weird to critique it as just a guy who I have a kid, but I am very aware that motherhood and fatherhood are very different things, at least in the way that I've experienced it with my wife.
Yeah, in our society, for sure. I mean, also just sort of it's going to be, but
the baby just doesn't, the baby didn't grow inside me. It didn't depend on me for nourishment for the first year and a half, so I don't know, I feel awkward critiquing it.
I do have a, this isn't a critique of this chapter, it's actually more of a critique of the rest of the book, which is this is the account heavy chapter, and I kind of wonder, all right, gender is happening and I don't really know how, and there's a thing here and I can't get my head around it. This is a half-baked thought. Why is the chapter on motherhood the one that has all the personal accounts? I feel like women also have things to say about community and practice and time. Why aren't there more women's accounts in those? I don't know. Maybe I'm just thinking too much about this. Somebody else tell me if I'm thinking too much about this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just one of those things that typically tends to be very heavily based on personal experience.
It's community too, though.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Isn't time too, as she discusses it? Those were also very personal.
Yeah. I
feel like there's gender happening
justifications.
Here.
Yeah,
that's kind of a silly phrasing, but I don't know how else to put it. I think it's the woman chapter that she's putting the woman. I'm not accusing her of misogyny, to be clear. I don't know what's happening here. Maybe she's right to do it this way, and I just don't see it. I just want to flag it. This isn't even criticism. I'm just flagging it because there's something happening here and I don't get it. The other thing I want to say is there's a bit towards the end about icons that I really liked. I don't really know what it was doing in this chapter, but I really liked it. It's about communication and imperfection and icons being used. Again, this is just me being a nerd. I really liked it. Also being a nerd, it kind of contained a rebuttal to one of William's points in the previous chapter. She writes, "We are all the same because we are created creatures before God. Any other claim upon ourselves and our identity can come after this." And I think that could have been a starting place for the thing about personal identity in the last chapter. I think that's a lot better than saying that a person's identity is entirely formed through the means by which they communicate.
Yes. True.
That's all.
Yes. All right, next chapter. Community. So, community, I would say, I read this chapter, I'm like, nothing was wrong per se. I didn't go through and be like, false.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
It was just, you framed this in a way I really wouldn't. And sort of I read it and I was like, oh, okay, I guess. A sort of frustrating thing about Williams is she tends to have like this really hyper optimistic, in an ideal world, without really accounting for, okay, but we're not in the real world. Like, sure, in a perfect scenario, this is how we would include autistic people, but an autistic person who is hyper echolalia, chirping very loudly, and I don't mean chirping in a negative way, but like making loud, literally chirping, making loud noises, and an autistic person in the same room who is hypersensitive to sound.
Yep.
aren't going to be able to be in the same community at once.
Yep.
If you go to any disability conference, you're going to see competing disability needs
Yep.
that overlap and really rub against each other.
Yep.
If you go to any group meeting of people with autism, one of the first things you will find is competing autisms that just negatively rub against each other, and in a really aggressive way. And there was no real treatment of that. No. It was, let's all be included in the community, and let's not separate ourselves, and let's
everybody be in the same room.
Yes.
And doing the same activity.
That is, I would say, naively optimistic to the point of uselessness. Like, it is so optimistic that it's yeah, I would actually say it's not useless, it's actively harmful.
Yeah.
Like it is actually detrimental to building autistic communities, because when you're building autistic communities, you, like, one of the reasons I pained about this before starting the podcast is building a Discord and being like, how am I going to manage this and police this so that we can manage competing autisms? Because those happen, you know. Yeah. These things do come up. And if you are like, no, we all need to be in the same room, we all need to be in the same place, it simply will not, like, it will fail. It will set you up for failure, and you're not contending with that. Like, I was just, the phrase that Jon likes to throw around a lot is, the problem with autism advocacy is that it's made up of the types of people who want to do autism advocacy. And what I mean by that is, certain people are drawn to certain discourses, and those people draw in other people who are like them because they like the same discourses.
Yeah.
It is very rare that you, in like progressive activist autism communities, that you get hyper analytical, extremely critical, pedantic nerds.
Yeah.
Because when we go into those, like, to be clear, that's a description of myself.
Me too.
Because when I go into those communities, the first thing I will do is someone will say something wrong, and I'll be like, that's not right. And they're very sensitive to criticism.
Yeah.
And so they hear criticism, and me, I am just trying to, I think it's kindness. I think what I am doing is a service to you, because I think if I said what you just said, I would want someone to point out that I had made a mistake.
Yep.
And they don't see it that way. And so attacked. I'm trying to be nice to them, and I am trying to save face for them and help them. And they are like, I am under attack, you dickhead.
Yeah.
That happens a lot. And so, like...
Does it?
When you... It does. It does. It happens a lot to me, I'll say.
No, sorry, I'm joking, because it happened to me, yesterday? Yeah.
Yes. And basically, just like, when you don't encounter these various different types of competing autism that really rub against each other, and you're building a liberation theology, your ideas are going to be, they're going to have an issue. And like, one thing she says is, Autistic Liberation Theology, as I hope to have already conveyed, is deeply suspicious of neurotypical political rhetoric that is too closely correlated with economic value and production. And it's like, okay, who is that for? Because this is not a rhetoric that's going to help most autistic people. It's like, and it's like, you are speaking within your very small, self-selected, concentrated bubble of autistic people who are very conscientious, very interested in doing these things, in a community that actively selects out autistic people that aren't like them. Like, it is survivorship bias, the musical, when it comes to these things. And so you're building an idea of autism, and it's like, well, what about the dark sides of the community? What
Yeah.
about autistic people who get angry and start punching walls and
Yeah.
breaking things? What about people who have meltdowns and they're not cute meltdowns? Like
Yeah.
they are extremely disruptive. Talking to autistic parents of autistic children, and they are like, we have so many issues with these types of things. You can't not address that in your community section, right? Like, talk about the bad stuff, the friction, the internal contradictions within autism, and like the internal competing things. Because honestly, the part about, you know, not wanting people in separate rooms and how that's not liberation. Okay, then I guess I really don't want liberation, and I don't think we should have it, because I think having those separated out rooms is often necessary to have different types of autistic people in the same community.
Yep.
Address that.
I don't know how else.
Address the allegations. And it was driving me up the wall, because in a perfect world in which autistic people and their different needs and their different disabilities did not synchronize.
Yeah.
Like, in a perfect world in which you didn't have these synchronization issues.
Yeah.
I would love this idea. We do not live in that world. We will never live in that world. Even if we solve all the economic issues, all the disability accommodation issues, in a perfect world with perfect disability accommodation, your communities are still going to have all of these issues, and you're going to need to reinvent self-segregation and all these things to deal with the fact that some people, due to autism, because of autism, are not going to be able to healthily interact with other people who are also autistic. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you mentioned is going to church is a draining thing for people. That's not an inclusion in a community if you're saying these people aren't going to church.
Yeah, sorry, to be clear, that's not because, because someone might take it this way. That's not because, we're going and we have to deal with microaggressions, which does happen, or, because it's very difficult to mask, which is true. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is it is just tiring to talk to people, even in the best case scenario. I don't want to say it's unpleasant. I actually find it very pleasant. I do find it tiring.
Yep.
And I always will.
It's like running. You know, you can.
Yeah. If you like running,
you can enjoy running. If you like running, you can enjoy running. You can have a great time running.
But
you don't want to run a marathon every week.
Yep.
Right? Like, that's just how it is. Yep. And this is naive optimism to the point where it is actively it is actively suggesting a way forward that I think would be genuinely bad for building community.
Yeah.
And I do not think you should follow those suggestions or this framework.
Yeah. There's a lot I could say about that, but I won't, because I think we're, got it covered basically.
Yes.
But, yeah.
So another phrase she said that like just grinded my gears was, I quote here, "However, the work of a liberation theologian, in whatever guise, is to call out oppression, even when those who are oppressed do not see it." I personally found that very frustrating, because like, okay, do you really need to call it out then? Like, if oppression isn't bothering these people, or if they are actively saying, I am not oppressed. Yeah. So this is something that I frequently bash heads with other autistic people with. I'm saying, look, I am not oppressed by virtue of autism because I happen to get into a very good place with my career and job and everything by luck and circumstance. I don't know how, but I did. And and it's basically like, okay, so you're saying autistic people are oppressed. I'm saying no, I'm not. I'm saying focus on everyone else. My big thing that I often say is, don't try to help me, help the people who need it more. Triage this. Right. And I just think so she emphasizes a lot in the book how things need to be grassroots. We need to be listening to autistic people. This needs to come from autism. But this is a direct contradiction of that.
Yeah.
It is.
I will. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, for sure. I mean, I think you're substantially right. I will say that there are certainly been cases where people who are oppressed didn't see it and even said they weren't oppressed, even though they were. I'm thinking of conservative women who didn't have the vote and who were, fighting to not have the vote. Right. I mean, they were oppressed. They said they weren't oppressed. So I do think
there were pro-slavery slaves.
Correct. But if you're going to say, no, you're wrong, you are oppressed, then you need to provide evidence.
Yes. And it is, that's a fair point. Like, there are groups who are not oppressed, or who are oppressed who will insist that they're not. But also,
there are certain,
there are also groups that aren't oppressed that people insist are.
Yeah.
How do you differentiate between the two? You substantiate.
To be clear for listeners, I don't know about you, but I was also going to say that, and would have been talking about white nationalists.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. So I always use gamers.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and is this helping? Yeah. I understand that you see this as your role, but are you helping anyone with this? Yeah. Is this doing anything? What if the people you're trying to help don't want your help?
Or this don't want the specific help you're offering?
Yes. It sort of reminds me of missionaries going to countries and being like, I'm here to save you. Yeah. And we don't really need that or want that. Okay, we don't need this. We need aid. We need accommodation or aid. I don't know. Because I think of this and it's like, okay, I'll assume for the sake of argument, I am oppressed. I don't realize it. Other people like me are oppressed who don't think we're oppressed, and we just don't realize it. Your solution is to come in with this idea of community liberation. And I think your idea is actively going to harm things and make my life worse.
And her specific claim is that it has to come from you.
Yes.
So that's a difficult thing to square, even if she's completely right. And again, I substantially agree with you. I just think, you do have to point out that there are cases where her explicit claim is correct.
Yes. And then so a little bit later on the same page, she says, members of the community group for disabled people may not see it as oppressive and may wholeheartedly enjoy their times in the programs designed for their needs. I've spoken to individuals who prefer to sit in separate rooms so that they do not disturb them with their exclamations and tics, their verbal disturbances, and that are unpredictable and embarrassing. However, this is not actual community. It is mitigation. And I disagree. That is community. That is community. If they are saying, I enjoy this and I want this, and I know many autistic people who are super self-conscious and who are like, I don't want people to see me like this, and it makes my life harder because I have to worry about bothering other people. And I know there's never going to be a world in which I'm not accidentally bothering other people, because people are just bothered by abnormalities, and I'm not going to be able to condition that out of them. However, this is not actually community, it's mitigation. It's like, no, mitigation as part of a community. It's valid.
And yes, I mean, I see that she might be thinking, well, ideally, the congregation won't mind, and this person will understand that and feel welcomed and loved. And okay, I'll grant that for now. I'm not 100% sure I agree, but let's grant it for the sake of argument. That's not the current condition, right? So in the current conditions, if this person says, no, the only way I can be here is if I'm in another room, I think she's thinking that the alternative is that they're in the sanctuary with everyone else, but the alternative might actually be that they're at home.
Yeah, exactly.
Also, speaking of being at home, does this mean that a person who is ill and so is at home, and so the priest has to come and administer the sacrament to them individually, does that mean they're not in community? Because I don't think it means they're not in community.
Yeah, and there are all sorts of different things where it's like you seem to have an extremely narrow imaginative framework that's extremely idealistic and just not reflective of reality. And even I just pragmatic considerations are really important to me, and making things as good as we can and not perfect is, I think, I'm a very big fan of the phrase do not let perfect be the enemy of good.
Yeah.
And in this case, I don't think perfect is achievable. I don't think and I think we can sort of demonstrate that. And even if we eliminate all these barriers, I still just think we're going to have all these issues because of these things that are just fundamental to the way that we interact and the way that we learn to interact. And if being part of a community means that you have to sometimes participate in that community in a way that looks different but is still okay with you, great. Keep doing that. And that just doesn't seem to be within her imagination for this.
She has a fear of looking different, and I shouldn't say that. It seems like she has a fear of looking different, or she is noticing what I think is a real fear of looking different among autistic people she's spoken to. And I think there's a real validity to that, but that means that anytime something looks different, it seems like she believes it is oppression.
Yeah. And I just simply don't agree with that framework. Like, reading this book, I came away even less convinced about the need for liberation, and more convinced that accommodation and like just a pragmatic accommodation approach of do whatever makes sense, just make it work, make them feel as good as you can, and understand the complexities and live in the nuanced complexity of what reality actually is just, I don't know.
Yeah.
So those are my thoughts on that community chapter.
Yeah.
The next chapter is practices. So practices, it's basically all. I could just repeat everything I said about the last chapter. And say here, this is a shorter chapter, but suffers from the same sort of, like we said at the very beginning, if the presumptions you make at the start are not correctly calibrated, everything that's derived from that is going to come out skewed. And I just think that those initial starting conditions were not properly calibrated and weren't justified. And because that really important initial legwork hasn't been done, that the rest of the project sort of all suffers the same types of issues.
Yeah. I mean, I think you and I are on the same page, with some exceptions. We're trying not to bring up issues that aren't pervasive.
Yeah. And so to sum this all up, I really wanted to like this book. Like, when I first saw it come out, I tried to speak to Claire Williams and be like, let's talk about your book. She just didn't respond to me, which is fine. I don't begrudge anyone for not talking to me. Yeah, maybe this was for the best. I think it is an attempt to do something about autistic liberation theology with a very specific lens of what autism is that doesn't account for nuance and complexity, and is sort of over idealistic and not engaging with sort of messy and uncomfortable realities that we actually have to deal with in everyday life, and very, very like progressive activism-y in its frame. I mean, she's obviously pulling a lot from critical studies and from academic discourses of liberation theology that prime these ways of thinking. And although I have read a lot of them, I don't think I am within those camps. So, of course, I'm going to sort of disagree with those at the start. But I've read liberation theology that I really liked. This was not one of them, and I thought it would because I'm autistic, and I thought this will be for me.
You're an autistic person who specifically has a project about making the church more accessible to autistic people.
Yes. Yeah. The explicit aim and goal is to make the church better and more accommodating to autistic people. And so I thought this will be in line. And unfortunately, I think Williams and I just see the world very, very differently. and our interactions with the various autistic communities are very, very different from one another, and that shapes why we have such strong why I have such strong disagreements. One question that I think we should discuss is who. So this book isn't for me. This book isn't for you. Who is this book for? Like, who would you recommend read it?
I think those are different questions.
Okay. Let's address.
I've thought a lot about this because when you introduced this book in the Discord, you said your big question was, who's this book for? And I kind of badgered you about that because there's multiple things you can mean by that and stuff. But now that I've read the book, I'm like, yeah, that is the right question. That was the right question. And the person who's best equipped to read this book is an academic theologian who already knows things about autism.
Yes, and specific, not just any academic theologian, an academic theologian on the progressive side of academic theology, who is very,
that's who will
very,
like it. I'm just narrowing on who's equipped to read it.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Who is equipped to read it? Yeah.
The person who's best equipped is an academic theologian who already knows things enough about autism to see where Williams goes wrong.
Yes.
But that's not think who it's for.
Yeah. I think if you aren't that person, many things in this book will not make sense or register to you.
I think the person who would best enjoy it is an autism advocacy activist who is Christian.
Yes.
That's a different person.
Yes. And I think that's sort of the whole range of people who would enjoy it.
Here. And the person to whom I'd recommend it isn't either of those either. It's a academic theology grad student who's looking for a research project. Because this book has a lot of lit review in it that I think is pretty good. And it has some questions in it that I think are interesting. And so I would love to give this to a theology grad student who knows enough about autism that they'll see where Williams goes wrong. Because they could mine this for great stuff. But the problem is that those are three different groups. So the person who's best equipped to make use of it, the person who's best equipped to read it, and the person who would most enjoy it are different people. And I think that's the heart of the problem.
Yeah. I would I wanted, like I said, I really wanted to like this book. I wanted to be like, everyone should read this when I first picked it up, because I thought this is going to be great. But as I read it, I was just like, I have done long form interviews with over 500 autistic people. I have had long interpersonal conversations with so many more that just weren't interviews, just autistic people that I know. I am deeply enmeshed within the autism Christian community, especially. And I'm trying to think of specific people I know who I would be like, you should pick up this book.
Yeah.
And I'm drawing a blank.
Yeah.
I can't think of someone. The only people that I could think of like you said, are theology grad students who are looking for something to do, and it's like you could write a paper about this book. Like you could
or even just
do an academic review.
or even just take a paragraph or a page of it. Read it, see what what page, what paragraph, what section interests you, and then look up her sources and address her questions. It doesn't have to be about her book, but I think it's an interesting source of ideas and resources. I do think it's that. I wish that's what she had focused on writing. If this was actually like an annotated bibliography with questions for future research, I think it would be a lot stronger. It wouldn't even have to change that much.
And yeah, so I think that is all we have for this. That is our first book review. Let us know if you want to do more, or if you want us to do more book reviews, or if you found this sort of thing interesting or useful. If you would like to contact me, you can find me on Twitter at ChristianityOn, or Blue Sky at ChristianityOn as well. You can email me on Gmail at ChristianityOnTheSpectrum@gmail.com. We now have a merch store. You can find it in the link where you can buy stickers of autism and Christianity stuff. All the proceeds go to the autistic artists that produce them. That is, I think, everything. Christian, do you want to let the good people of the podcast know how to contact you or not?
Yeah, I'm on Blue Sky. You can find me there. CER Hendricks, HENDRKS at bisky.social if you want to.
Yep. We also have a Discord if you'd like to join the Discord. Christian's there too.
I will warn you, it is full of autistic people.
Yes, it is. and full of many of the things that we were talking about that come from autistic communities.
And to be clear, I am one of them.
Yes.
This is not.
we are all them. It's a great time. I really like it. If you are autistic and looking for autistic Christians, you'll find a lot of us there.
It is fun.
Yes. Fun. Yeah. All right. That's everything. We'll stop it here.